Hey, welcome back. GED, test preparation, history exam. We're trying to form a timeline for you. Just look at all that it goes on. If you can keep your idea on what happened, I know you guys have some idea of what went on, and I'm sure you have a lot more, but try to keep in what happened, how things got started, European arrival in North America, um, the puritanical movement. If some of you were reading history with Historyv1 in the Crucible, American independence, Trail of Tears starts, Indian Removal Act, states' rights and slavery, think about that in terms of America becoming bankrupt because that's what led to the Civil War. Progressive era, you had the 1870s where you had Reconstruction, but then you had the Progressive era after that. New Deal came more in the 1830s, stock market crash. That was our first one, World War II. McCarthy era, that era, they wanted to keep a hold of communism. A lot of actors and actresses were blacklisted from Hollywood. Vietnam War came in late 60s, didn't end until the 70s. The war was so costly to Americans. That was a very important point. And civil rights movement was going on with the Vietnam War. United Farm Workers movement was a product of the civil rights movement. Cesar Chavez, Dr. King talked about similarities, workers being exploited and underpaid. And Cesar Chavez he was one of the founding members, but he was responsible for the UFW, called the United Farm Workers Movement. And then you have NAFTA, those are peace treaties and talks. So if you can put all of this as some kind of constructive method of looking at it as a timeline and of looking at how things go on, that might help you when you're on the tests, to learn how to think through what it could be and what era and what time. So we made a timeline, started with the 1400s, European invasion in America, Iroquois, Algonquin, Cherokees, forced off their land in Georgia, also parts of Florida. This is in the 1830s. But remember, the Iroquois Algonquins had been here before. And you just have to look at, all different kinds of Indian members existed all throughout the United States and even in Canada, but the GED doesn't ask you about Canadian Native Americans. So, okay, already went over. We're just trying to keep our timeline. Okay, here we go. 1400s to 1600s. Try to think in terms of lines. Thinking linearly will help you. 1400s to 1600s. Then you go to 1700s. America had its own problem questing independence from British. So remember, July 4th is celebrated for a reason. 1776 to 1885, people wanted patriotism. The Indian Removal Act comes after that. We had patriotism 1776 to 1885, because keep in mind, during that, there was a big battle in the 1860s about, are you being patriotic if you still own slaves? Or if you don't believe in supporting the Union. That was Civil War, happened here in the United States. Okay, slavery and issues, Stephen Douglas debate. They may ask one or two questions on the GED about that. So if you can just remember, Stephen Douglas debate was in the 1850s. We'll go into detail in the next slide about what they were about. But right now, you're just trying to get a timeline so you can think through it. Sitting Bull is Sioux chief. He's one of the last standing. He and Geronimo, a couple others, that really tried to talk to the United States government and stood against them, but still, ultimately some of them were murdered, and his death sparked an outcry. So that's why it's in the GED book as one of the most important parts of our timeline. First industrial Revolution, 1890s, 1900s, a lot of immigrants from Europe, including Italy, Poland, Germany, came over here and had to live in very harsh conditions, and especially in places like New York. And a lot of disease was spread. There weren't enough medicines, and people weren't as wealthy as people are then in medicine. We didn't have the healthcare system that we had then. So these revolutions and the Industrial Revolution, out of that came, we need more help for the poor. Okay, so Second Industrial Revolution, people are still poor. And in between 1929 and the 1930s, you had a lot of depression, almost as bad as what it is now, but people were standing in bread lines. And these are some of the things that happened. So here you go. Just going to let you look at it. You can always slow these slides down, look at them for yourself. So New Deal came around. This is former president. If you just want to memorize FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. New Deal ensured food for Americans, immediate repair to banking institutions. A couple of years after that, Pearl Harbor. That's a question they're going to ask you, because Pearl Harbor was very significant to the United States, because the United States owned that Pearl Harbor. It's an island on Hawaii, and the United States government owned it, and the Japanese bombed it. So the United States took that very, very much as an insult, and they turned around and bombed Nagasaki, Japan, and Hiroshima. Okay. Cold War developed between the Soviet Union, now known as current Russia. The United States kind of didn't like Russia or the Soviet Union, their politics. As an offspring of that, they really wanted to control countries that were labeled as communist, and at the time, Russia was labeled that way. Okay, Senator Joseph McCarthy labeled persons, including actors, as communists. People were really afraid, and they called it the Red Scare, because the Red Scare meant that you were a communist, and if you were one of those people, you were horrible. People got labeled, people got bullied and harassed. Very important era in the 50s. Truman Doctrine, he said, okay, anybody that wants to be friends with communist countries, we won't help them, because we really want to not help communist countries. And with that came the policy of containment. Wanted to constrict Russian expansion. See, guys, with what's going on, I guess a lot of you kind of know why. Okay, 1950 to 1955, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. It's just that this is still going on, and although for different reasons, and our attitude really was supposed to go over and help, but it was based in the Truman Doctrine, which was written almost, 60 years ago. Another important part was the Vietnam War. America's involvement came with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. A lot of people thought the Vietnamese were trying to become a communist country, and again, even though this happened in '64, goes back to Truman's doctrine of the 1950s. 1960s, because of communism, a lot of people are like, hey, 10 years ago you were jailing people, stopping people from acting in Hollywood because of what you thought their involvement was. You were limiting what people read and wrote right here in the United States. So we're going to start talking about social justice and things we're allowed to do. President John F. Kennedy was a very good person who tried to hear all of these comments. He was a little bit lax. He and his, and when I say lax, I mean he was lax enough to realize that people needed more freedom. He and his brother Robert F. Kennedy were trying to get rid of some of the restrictive powers of government. He wanted to stop the invasion in Vietnam because America was losing a lot of people. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in November of 1963. At that time, former Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson became the new president, and he began the War on Poverty plan. He wanted to make equal housing for people. He wanted to get a healthcare system in place for the average person, education and aid to the poor. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The reason, not only because he was a great person, but also the assassination was very, very important because April 4th, 1968, there were a lot of riots breaking out because people thought the American government was involved with his death. And, he was really, since the 1930s and the 1950s, he was one of the most prominent African American leaders that really got out and spoke against injustices and actually invoked some kind of change. Dr. King and Cesar Chavez were comrades, and both of them believed in social justice for all people, but each one took a level, and a lot of migrant workers were getting sick. They were underpaid and underfed. And a lot of these people picked grapes in California. They weren't picking these grapes near the Santa Monica Boulevard or over off the beach. They were picking them in deserts and in areas where you could get spores, meaning you could get lung cancer, you could get sick, and Chavez stood up for that. Unfortunately, a few years after that, they say he died of natural causes. The American Indian movement, called AIM, it was a movement started in 1968 where Native Americans, some people you might see on the exam say Indians, they were asking for reparations since their ancestors were killed and displaced. And there was a march on 1972 called the Trail of Tears. And if you ever hear the Trail of Tears, remember the original started with the Indian Native American movement. And the reason it was called the Trail of Tears, you can go back and look at the beginning slide on this video. It was called the Trail of Tears is because there was a trail starting in Georgia, going over to Texas, going over the Oregon Trail, and the United States government went around and said, we are displacing you, we are moving you, and you have to go. Pretty scary. But I'm going to let you guys, if you want to slow this at any time, look at this. You can use this as note cards. And again, this is not meant to be questions. It is simply a timeline. Thanks for watching.